The courtroom was quiet, save for the sound of a gavel striking the wooden desk. Angela Roberts, a tall black woman in her late 30s, stood calmly in front of the judge. Her hands were folded in front of her, the only outward sign of her inner determination. She had known this moment was coming. After weeks of organizing, planning, and speaking out at town meetings, she had expected pushback. What she hadn't anticipated was being fined for it. The judge, an older man known for his strict interpretation of the law, gave her a sharp look as he announced the penalty. $500, the judge said, his voice cold. You've disrupted a public meeting, and I'm fining you for your actions today. Consider this a warning to follow the proper channels next time. Angela didn't flinch. She had anticipated worse, yet she knew that the fine would be just one small obstacle. This was the moment where so many others before her had buckled under pressure, but she wasn't about to let it stop her. What started as one small protest against the local government's neglect of her neighborhood had now grown into something far more significant, a growing movement that was already attracting attention beyond the small town she called home. As the judge's words echoed through the room, Angela glanced briefly toward the gallery. A few local reporters were taking notes, and in the back of the room, several community members, many of whom had joined her at the town hall protest, watched with curiosity. Some looked worried. Others looked more inspired than ever. Angela's resolve only grew stronger as she realized that their eyes were on her. This fine was a symbol of everything that needed to change, not just in her town, but across the country. The gavel struck again. Case dismissed. Angela nodded, stepping down from the podium. Her legs were steady beneath her as she exited the courtroom, but her mind was already moving ahead, thinking of what came next. As soon as she was outside, she was greeted by a group of supporters waiting by the courthouse steps. They clapped and cheered, their faces filled with admiration. "Don't worry about that fine, Angela," one woman said, her voice filled with hope. "We're behind you. You're doing something big." Angela smiled, grateful for their support, but she didn't waste time with small talk. She had a larger mission ahead. The fine wasn't just a personal setback. It was a signal that the fight she was starting had hit a nerve. She was ready to keep pushing forward. There was too much at stake now to turn back. Her movement had only just begun. As Angela walked to her car, a thought struck her. This fine, this moment of opposition, would be the spark that ignited something far greater. She was just getting started. Angela Roberts had always believed that change wasn't something that simply happened. It was something you fought for. Growing up in a neighborhood that often felt invisible to those in power, Angela learned early on that the system didn't work for everyone. Her parents worked hard, but they never seemed to get ahead. Their small house was surrounded by rundown buildings, neglected schools, and streets riddled with potholes. Yet the city government, year after year, continued to pour resources into wealthier areas, leaving places like hers in the dust. Angela couldn't ignore it anymore. Her earliest memories were of listening to her parents talk about the world's inequalities over dinner. Her mother would share stories of their neighbors struggling to make ends meet, while her father talked about his experiences with bureaucracy, how difficult it was to navigate a system that didn't seem designed for people like him. These conversations planted the seeds of Angela's future activism, but it wasn't until she moved back to her hometown as an adult that the urgency to act truly settled in. She was in her mid-20s when she began to get involved. At first, it was small efforts, attending city council meetings, raising concerns about the lack of resources for local schools, volunteering for organizations that helped struggling families. But those small steps quickly grew into something larger when she realized that real change wouldn't come from polite requests or behind-the-scenes negotiations. If things were ever going to improve, she would have to shake up the system. The more she advocated, the more she realized that other people shared her frustrations. There were other voices, quiet but steady, calling out for help, and they needed to be amplified. Angela started organizing rallies, holding meetings with local leaders, and speaking out at town halls. At first, she was met with resistance. Politicians were quick to dismiss her as an idealist, too naive to understand the complexity of government. But Angela knew that sometimes change started with discomfort, with challenging the status quo. It wasn't long before Angela's quiet efforts started to gain attention. Her work began to attract a core group of like-minded individuals, people who saw in her the same drive for justice and equality that they carried in their hearts. Together, they began to strategize, planning bigger and bolder moves. Angela was becoming a voice for the voiceless, channeling her frustration into action. She started to see that this movement was not just about changing the rules for her neighborhood, but for countless others like it, all across the country. One evening, after a particularly heated town hall, Angela stood in the parking lot, her heart racing. She could feel something shifting beneath her feet, a sense that she was on the verge of something monumental. She didn't know it yet, but that was the moment her quiet efforts would snowball into a movement that would be felt far beyond her town. It was time to take her voice to the next level. There was no turning back now. Angela's movement gained momentum quickly, fueled by a deep desire for change and an ever-growing group of supporters. What had started as a small act of defiance in her local town hall was now turning into a ripple that spread across the country. The quiet conversations around dinner tables in neglected neighborhoods were turning into loud, impassioned calls for action. It was as if Angela had sparked a flame, and now it was impossible to ignore. The first sign of something larger came when Angela's protest was covered by the local news. Her speech, delivered with conviction and honesty, had resonated with people far beyond the town's borders. It wasn't just the residents of her neighborhood who felt the sting of neglect. It was people in other cities, other states, who saw in Angela's words their own struggles reflected. Her call for fairness, for resources to be spread equitably, echoed in places where people had long been silenced by the weight of systemic barriers. Soon, social media began to buzz with support. Hashtags dedicated to her movement appeared overnight, and people started sharing their own stories of feeling unheard and invisible. Angela hadn't planned for this kind of response. It was overwhelming, but it was also exactly what she needed. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the thousands, the millions, who were waiting for someone to finally speak out for them. Angela started receiving messages from people across the country, mothers in urban cities, teachers in rural schools, activists in small towns, who all wanted to join her cause. They shared her belief that change was overdue, and they saw her as a leader who could bring people together. It became clear that Angela wasn't alone in her fight. She had become the face of a movement that was bigger than she had ever imagined. She began organizing town halls in other cities, traveling to communities that had long been ignored by politicians. The more she spoke, the more people joined. But it wasn't just the numbers that started to shift. It was the tone. People weren't just asking for change anymore. They were demanding it. And Angela, who had once been the lone voice in her town, was now standing at the center of a nationwide movement for justice, equality, and reform. However, with this growth came new challenges. Local governments, who had initially dismissed her as a troublemaker, began to see her as a real threat. Angela's critics ramped up their efforts to discredit her, calling her actions disruptive, even radical. But Angela didn't back down. She had seen too much in her own life to let those who benefited from the system's inequalities dictate her next move. Every challenge only made her more determined. The wave of change was unstoppable now. By the time Angela was invited to speak at a national conference on social justice, her name had become synonymous with a new kind of activism, one that was unapologetically bold, relentlessly focused, and unwavering in its demand for fairness. What had started as a local protest was now something much more powerful. It was a movement in full force, and it was just getting started. As Angela's movement continued to gain national traction, the judge who had once fined her sat in his office, uncertain and troubled. The fine he had imposed on Angela that day felt distant now, like a small isolated event in a much larger story. He had expected the protest to fizzle out, After all, that's what most activists did. They showed up, made a little noise, and then disappeared. But Angela Roberts wasn't like most activists. She was proving to be something far more influential. The judge's office had become a quiet haven for his growing confusion. He had read the newspapers, seen the interviews with Angela, and heard the buzz on social media. At first, he was dismissive. After all, she was just a local woman, right? But as the weeks passed, he couldn't ignore the impact her voice was having. He found himself pulled into the conversations surrounding her work, discussions about systemic inequities, government accountability, and a growing demand for reform. It wasn't just the media coverage that had caught his attention. It was the stories he was hearing from people in his own community. The protests Angela had sparked were not just about her specific town. They were about something much larger. People were speaking out about long-standing issues, lack of resources, ignored neighborhoods, and the stark realities of racial and economic disparity. These were issues that the judge had never truly considered before, and now they were knocking on his door. He decided to reach out to Angela. It wasn't a decision he took lightly. He had been the one to find her, and he had seen her as nothing more than an inconvenience. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, a sense that perhaps he had misjudged her. He had always prided himself on his understanding of the law, but this movement seemed to be pushing the boundaries of what he had been taught. He had to know more. Angela agreed to meet, and when the judge entered the small cafe where they had arranged to sit, he was taken aback by her calm presence. She wasn't angry, though he expected her to be. Instead, she greeted him with a warm handshake and a steady gaze. It was clear that she had a purpose, but she wasn't there to argue. She was there to share her story, why she had started this fight, and what it meant to her. "I've spent my life watching my community struggle," she told him, "and I've had enough of being ignored. It's time for change, and that's why I'm doing this." As Angela spoke, the judge found himself listening in a way he never had before. He was hearing not just her words, but the deep-seated frustration and hope that drove her. He had expected to meet a fiery protester, but what he found was a thoughtful, articulate leader who was pushing for something much bigger than herself. The judge sat back, his mind racing. This was no longer just about a fine or a protest. It was about a shift in the fabric of society. And suddenly, he realized, Angela wasn't the one who had been in the wrong. The following week, the judge found himself deep in thought more often than not. His conversation with Angela had unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had always prided himself on his impartiality, on his ability to see things from a legal standpoint. But Angela had introduced him to a broader perspective, one that went beyond the black and white of the law and delved into the complexities of real human lives. The judge had spent years upholding the rules of the court with unwavering conviction. But now, as he sat in his office, he began to question whether those rules had always served the greater good. He couldn't help but reflect on his own past, on the times he had turned a blind eye to the subtle biases that shaped his decisions, and the times he had dismissed the pleas of individuals like Angela as mere noise. He had always seen himself as a figure of authority, but now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been blind to the power dynamics that underpinned his judgments. The more the judge thought about it, the more he realized that Angela's cause wasn't something he could ignore. It wasn't just a local issue. It was a question of fairness and justice on a much larger scale. He had witnessed firsthand the struggles faced by people who had been overlooked by the systems designed to protect them. He had seen the stories of those who had been left behind. And yet, he had never truly understood the full weight of their experiences until now. Angela's movement, he now saw, wasn't simply a challenge to local authority. It was a call to address the deeper issues that had been neglected for far too long. It was this newfound understanding that led the judge to take an unprecedented step. He decided to meet Angela again, but this time, he wasn't just reaching out to hear her side. He was reaching out to apologize. He couldn't change his ruling, but he could acknowledge that his actions had been short-sighted and that he had failed to see the full picture. When they met again, Angela was surprised but appreciative of the judge's gesture. He was no longer the stern figure she had faced in court. He was now someone willing to listen, to admit that he had made a mistake. "I thought a lot about what you said that day," the judge began, looking directly at Angela. "I've been a judge for many years, but I never understood the bigger picture until you opened my eyes. I misjudged you, and I was wrong to do so." Angela sat silently for a moment, absorbing his words. She had been prepared for him to dismiss her again, but here he was, offering something entirely different: accountability. "I appreciate that," she said, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about people like me who have been waiting for change for too long." The judge nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He understood now. Angela wasn't just an activist. She was leading a movement that could reshape the future. And he, too, would have to change if he wanted to be a part of that future. As the weeks passed, the transformation in the judge's perspective became evident to those around him. He began attending town meetings and listening to voices that had long been overlooked. He had learned to hear not just the words, but the stories behind them, the frustration, the hope, and the urgency for change. Angela's movement had sparked a fire, and now he was starting to see its full force. Meanwhile, Angela's reach continued to grow. She was no longer just a local figure. She was quickly becoming a national symbol of resistance and reform. Her calls for equitable distribution of resources, government accountability, and fairness were gaining traction in cities far beyond her own. Media outlets were eager to interview her, politicians were reaching out for her support, and grassroots organizations were rallying behind her. Angela had become the face of a new era of activism, one that was rooted in community and driven by an unshakable belief in justice. One morning, Angela received an invitation to speak at a national conference on social justice, one of the most prestigious events of its kind. The conference would bring together politicians, activists, and scholars from all over the country, and Angela had been selected as one of the keynote speakers. The invitation was both thrilling and overwhelming. She knew that the eyes of the nation would be on her, but she also understood the responsibility that came with such a platform. This was her chance to speak directly to those in power, to make her case for a world where people like her, people who had been overlooked and marginalized, had a real voice. Angela arrived at the conference with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The grand hall was filled with people from all walks of life, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her shoulders. She knew that her words could have a lasting impact. This was her opportunity to shift the conversation on a national scale. When it was her turn to speak, Angela walked up to the podium, her heart pounding. She looked out at the audience, so many faces, some skeptical, some hopeful, and took a deep breath. "I stand before you not as an individual, but as a representative of millions who have been forgotten," Angela began, her voice clear and steady. "We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for the same rights, the same opportunities that everyone else receives. We are demanding fairness, because fairness is the foundation of any just society." The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Angela spoke with passion, but also with a sense of quiet authority. She knew that the conversation was shifting, and she was determined to keep pushing it forward. As her speech came to an end, the audience erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was the kind of applause that signified a turning point. Angela had made her mark, and her message had been heard. Her movement was no longer a small spark. It had grown into a fire that was impossible to ignore. And the judge, who had once dismissed her as just another protester, was now among those watching in awe, understanding that he had witnessed something historic unfold before him. Angela had done it. She had taken the first step toward the change she had dreamed of. And there was no turning back. The roar of applause from the conference hall lingered in Angela's ears long after she stepped off the stage. She had expected nervousness, but what she felt instead was an overwhelming sense of purpose. The room had responded to her message, and she knew, without a doubt, that it was just the beginning. This was not the end of her journey. It was the start of something much larger. Back in her own city, the changes that Angela had fought for were beginning to take shape. The attention her speech had garnered was just the catalyst for a wave of reform efforts across the country. Legislators, who had once turned a blind eye to her calls for change, were now opening doors to dialogue. In several key cities, mayors and council members reached out to Angela's movement to learn how they could apply her framework of fairness and opportunity to their own communities. Angela's grassroots organization, which had once been a small group of determined citizens, now had a national platform. Volunteers and activists across the country worked tirelessly, knocking on doors, organizing marches, and pressuring local leaders to adopt policies that would address the inequities in housing, education, and healthcare. The growing influence of the movement was undeniable, and the pressure on government officials to act was becoming too great to ignore. Then, one morning, Angela received a call that would mark the culmination of years of work. A bill that reflected the core tenets of her movement, allocating resources to underserved areas, reforming government programs, and instituting better protections for marginalized communities, had passed through Congress. It was a monumental victory, one that could change the course of history. Angela's heart raced as she read through the details. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was real, concrete change. The bill included provisions for millions of dollars in funding for underfunded schools, job programs aimed at closing the employment gap, and healthcare initiatives for communities that had long been neglected. The legislation also outlined the creation of new government offices dedicated to addressing racial and economic disparities across the country. The phone call was a blur of congratulations, but Angela could barely focus on the voices at the other end of the line. Her thoughts were consumed with the realization that her movement had succeeded. The impossible had become possible. But Angela also knew that this victory wasn't hers alone. It was the result of years of tireless work from countless individuals, volunteers, activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had stood with her from the very beginning. They were the ones who had believed when others didn't. And yet, despite this triumph, Angela wasn't content to sit back. As much as the bill was a huge step forward, she knew that change was an ongoing battle. There were still systems to challenge, hearts to change, and more work to be done. She couldn't afford to slow down now. Looking out over her city from her office window, Angela smiled to herself. This was just one victory in a long struggle, but it was a victory that would echo for generations. She had helped shape the future, and this was only the beginning. Years passed, and Angela's movement continued to thrive. The reforms that had once seemed impossible were now embedded in the fabric of society. The changes she had fought for, equitable education, healthcare access, and economic opportunity, had become a reality in communities across the nation. But Angela was never one to rest on her laurels. She continued to work tirelessly, pushing for even more progress, knowing that true change was a continuous process. One crisp autumn morning, Angela received an invitation to return to the same courthouse where she had once stood, fined and dismissed. The letter was from the judge who had fined her years ago, the one who had once seen her as a troublemaker. Angela hadn't expected this, but as she read the letter, she realized it was an opportunity to reflect on how far they had both come. The courthouse steps were still the same, cold stone, and worn by years of use. But today, they felt different. Angela stood at the bottom, looking up at the doors that had once felt so intimidating. She had been there as a defendant. But today, she was walking through those doors as a symbol of change. Inside, the judge awaited her. His hair was grayer now, his face more weathered by time, but there was a quiet humility in his expression as he stood to greet her. "Angela," he said, extending his hand. "I never thought I'd be standing here with you, but I'm grateful that I am." Angela shook his hand, a warm smile spreading across her face. "It's good to see you again." They sat together, and the judge began. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the past. I've seen the movement you started, and I've seen the way it's transformed our country. I need to tell you that I was wrong about you. Back then, I thought I was doing my job by enforcing the law, but I didn't understand the bigger picture. You weren't just breaking the rules. You were challenging a system that needed to change." Angela listened quietly, the weight of his words settling over her. It was a moment she had never expected. An acknowledgement of growth, of learning, of progress. The same judge who had once fined her now recognized the depth of her work and the importance of the movement she had led. "I want to publicly apologize," he continued, "and I want to tell you that your courage has had an immeasurable impact on me and many others. You've changed my perspective, and I think I speak for many when I say that your work has made this country better." Angela took a deep breath, the emotion in her chest rising. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but full of gratitude. "But this is not just about me. It's about all the people who believed in this cause. I didn't do this alone. We all did it together." The judge nodded. "I understand that now, and I'm proud to have witnessed it." As they stood to leave, the judge placed a hand on Angela's shoulder. "You've shown us all what true leadership looks like," he said softly. "And for that, we owe you a debt of gratitude." Angela smiled, her eyes filled with the knowledge that the journey was far from over. But this moment, this full circle moment, was a reminder that change could begin with just one person's determination, and that perhaps was the greatest victory of all.